They laughed the first time they saw smoke rising from the Caboose chimney. Not because smoke was unusual in winter, because it was rising from a train car sitting alone in a frozen field half a mile from the nearest tracks. The old Caboose leaned slightly on timber blocks where Elias Mercer had set it down after hauling it off the abandoned rail spur with 2 draft horses and a week of stubbornness. Rust streaked the iron sides. The wheels still sat beneath it, locked forever in place. One faded line of lettering remained visible through weathered paint. Union Freight Line, 473. To everyone else in the valley, it looked like scrap. To Elias, it looked finished. That was the difference. Most homes in the valley began as piles of lumber. The Caboose already had walls, already had a roof, already had a stove vent. More importantly, it had been designed for winter travel. Railroad men did not survive mountain routes in weak cars. The walls were layered iron over thick timber framing. The windows were small, the space compact, easy to heat, hard to draft. Elias understood all of that immediately. The valley did not. You planning to ride away when spring comes? Harlan Pike shouted the day Elias dragged the Caboose into the field. Only if your cabin gets colder than mine, Elias answered. The men nearby laughed. Not cruelly at first, just confidently, because nobody in their right mind chose to live in an abandoned train car, especially not through a northern winter. But Elias had already spent enough winters in drafty cabins to stop caring about appearances. He had worked freight lines for years before the rail company collapsed sections of track through the valley. He knew what the Cabooses were built to endure. Endless wind, mountain snow, freezing nights while standing idle between routes. The little iron cars survived because they trapped heat efficiently. Small spaces always did. So when the rail company abandoned several damaged cars near the spur outside town, Elias bought one for less than the cost of a proper timber frame. Then he hauled it home. That was when the real work began. The Caboose still smelled faintly of coal smoke and machine oil when he first stepped inside it alone. The floorboards creaked. Frost coated the corners. One bench had collapsed inward from rot. Most men would have stripped it for parts. Elias rebuilt it instead. He replaced damaged flooring first, then insulated beneath it using wool scraps, sawdust, and packed straw sealed between joists. He repaired the tiny iron stove mounted near the center wall and lined the surrounding area with salvage brick to hold heat longer after fires burned low. The windows mattered most. Train windows were small by design, but years of neglect had warped their seals. Elias rebuilt every frame carefully, packing gaps with cloth and pine resin before fitting storm shutters over the outside. No drafts, no wasted heat. Then he built a small wooden entry platform outside the side door with a narrow enclosed vestibule just large enough for boots, coats, and snow-covered gear. A buffer space. One more layer between winter and warmth. The valley mocked that hardest of all. He built a porch for a boxcar. Maybe the train gets lonely. Elias ignored them, because he knew something they didn't. Winter punishes large spaces first. Every extra room is another mouth demanding heat. Every high ceiling is warmth drifting somewhere useless. The Caboose had none of that. One compact room, curved ceiling, heavy walls, limited air volume, everything close enough to share warmth. By first frost, the inside no longer looked like freight equipment. Warm lantern light glowed against polished wood walls. Shelves lined the corners. A narrow bed sat beneath one window. Hooks held coats drying beside the stove. Compact, orderly, intentional. Caleb Turner visited first out of curiosity. He climbed the short wooden stairs into the Caboose, ducked through the door, and stopped immediately. Well, he admitted slowly, this is less miserable than expected. Elias handed him coffee. High praise. Caleb looked around. The room wasn't hot. That surprised him. Most poorly insulated spaces required roaring fires to stay comfortable. But the stove burned low. Steady. The warmth lingered instead of escaping. You barely feeding that thing? Caleb asked. Doesn't need much. Caleb pressed one hand against the iron wall near the stove. Warm. Then farther away near the rear bench. Still not cold. How? Elias pointed downward first. Insulated floor. Then upward. Small space. Then toward the iron shell itself. And thick walls that already know winter. Caleb laughed once. That sounds almost poetic. It sounds expensive if you're buying firewood. That part stayed with Caleb. Because everyone in the valley measured winter partly in wood. How much you stacked. How fast you burned it. How worried you became by February. Elias cut less than anyone already. People noticed. Then the early storms arrived. Not blizzards yet. Just hard northern winds driving snow sideways across open ground. Cabins creaked. Door seams whistled. Families shoved rags into cracks and burned extra wood to keep up. Inside the caboose, Elias listened to snow strike the iron shell in soft rhythmic bursts. The sound should have felt cold. Instead it felt secure. The insulated walls dulled the worst of it. The compact interior warmed quickly each evening and stayed warm surprisingly long after the stove settled low. No wasted corners. No frozen back rooms. No heat disappearing into empty space. One night, during the season's first serious freeze, Caleb returned after helping his father split wood until dark. He entered the caboose shivering, then blinked. The stove glowed only faintly. Yet the room remained comfortable enough that Elias sat reading without gloves. Caleb stared openly this time. Our kitchen fire's twice that size. Your kitchen's twice this size. More than twice. Elias nodded. That's the problem. Caleb slowly removed his coat. No drafts touched his neck. No cold crept along the floorboards. Even the windows remained mostly clear instead of frosting thick at the edges. It holds the heat, Caleb said quietly. Elias smiled slightly. That's what railroad men paid for. The valley still laughed outside the caboose. But now the laughter carried uncertainty. Because smoke from Elias's chimney stayed thin while theirs thickened. Because he chopped less wood. Because he slept through nights others spent waking to feed fires. And because every storm that passed seemed to prove the same uncomfortable truth. The strangest home in the valley might also be the smartest. Then December arrived hard. 3 days of wind from the northern pass, without pause. Snow piled against doors faster than people could shovel it clear. Cabin walls groaned under the pressure. And one night, just after midnight, pounding shook the caboose door hard enough to rattle the lantern hooks inside. Elias set down his book and crossed the caboose in 3 steps. The pounding came again. Urgent. Desperate. He opened the outer vestibule door carefully against the wind. Snow burst inward around a figure bent nearly double beneath the storm. Harlan Pike. Behind him stood Mrs. Tolland, clutching her grandson beneath layers of blankets. Our stovepipe collapsed. Harlan shouted over the wind. Whole place filled with smoke. Elias stepped aside immediately. Get in before the door freezes shut. They stumbled through the narrow vestibule while Elias slammed the outer door, closed behind them. Snow slid from coats and boots in thick clumps across the wooden floor. Then he opened the inner caboose door. Warmth met them instantly. Not blazing heat. Steady heat. The child stopped trembling first. Mrs. Tolland stared openly at the room as she entered. The iron stove glowed softly near the center wall. Lantern light reflected warmly against polished wood. Steam drifted from a kettle hanging above the firebox. Most surprising of all, the space felt calm. Outside, the blizzard screamed across the valley hard enough to shake barns apart. Inside the caboose, the storm sounded distant. Muted beneath insulated walls and compact construction. Harlan removed his gloves slowly. You're barely burning that stove. Barely need to, Elias answered. Mrs. Tolland looked around in disbelief. No drafts. Elias pointed toward the vestibule behind them. That little room stops most of the cold before it enters. Harlan shook his head. We laughed at this thing. Elias handed the boy a hot cup wrapped in cloth. Winter usually corrects people eventually. Another knock interrupted them. Then another. Within the hour, 6 more people crowded into the caboose. Caleb Turner arrived carrying split wood beneath one arm. Old Mr. Wexler came after losing half his roof to drifting snow. 2 Miller children appeared wrapped together beneath a horse blanket after their bedroom wall began icing from the inside. By midnight, the caboose held nearly everyone who could not keep heat properly anymore. And somehow, it still worked. That was what astonished them most. The room was small, yes, but because it was designed efficiently, the heat remained balanced. The curved ceiling prevented cold pockets. The insulated floor stopped freezing air from rising beneath their feet. The iron shell radiated warmth evenly once heated. No one sat shivering near the walls. No one fought for space beside the stove. The caboose held them together the way railroad men once intended during mountain winters. Caleb leaned back against the wall near the rear bench and laughed quietly. All this time we thought you were living in scrap. Elias added another modest split log to the fire. Most people confuse ugly with useless. Outside, the storm worsened. Snow hammered the iron roof in waves. Wind screamed across the field hard enough to shake the exterior stairs. Somewhere in the valley, a loud, cracking sound echoed faintly through the darkness. Probably a shed roof collapsing. Nobody inside the caboose moved. For the first time all winter, many of them felt truly protected. Not just warmed. Protected. That difference mattered. The blizzard continued until dawn. When morning finally arrived, Elias opened the outer vestibule door carefully against a wall of drifted snow nearly reaching the roofline. Cold air rushed inward briefly. Everyone inside felt how savage it still was outside. Then the door shut again, and the warmth returned almost immediately. Harlan stared at the walls in disbelief. It loses heat slower than a cabin. It's smaller than a cabin, Elias corrected. That too. But Harlan understood now. Winter was not only about building stronger. Sometimes it was about building smarter. By afternoon, the storm weakened enough for people to leave. They stepped outside into a valley transformed. Drifts buried fences completely. One cabin roof had collapsed inward. Several chimneys leaned dangerously beneath packed snow. Woodpiles across town had shrunk alarmingly after weeks of overburning. Yet smoke still rose steadily from the caboose chimney. Thin, efficient, controlled. That image spread faster than gossip ever could. Within days, the valley began asking questions instead of making jokes. How much wood did the caboose actually use? How thick were the walls? How did the vestibule help so much? Did the iron freeze? Did condensation build inside? Elias answered patiently. Small heated spaces outperform large ones. Insulation matters more than appearance. Air gaps matter. Draft control matters. Heat retention matters most of all. Caleb visited almost daily after that, helping reinforce the snow barriers around the caboose base. You know what bothers them most? He asked one evening. That I was right? Caleb grinned. That they spent years building bigger and colder while a railroad car solved half the problem. Elias laughed quietly at that. Because it was true. The valley had always treated size as strength. Large cabins, large fires, large woodpiles. But winter punished excess. Every extra foot demanded heat. Every draft stole effort. The caboose wasted nothing. By late winter, changes began appearing across town. Families closed off and used rooms with blankets and timber partitions. Small vestibules appeared beside cabin entrances. People insulated floors instead of only roofs. One farmer even dragged an abandoned freight wagon beside his barn and converted it into a heated sleeping room during storms. The mocking disappeared entirely, replaced by imitation. Then spring finally broke the valley open. Snow melted slowly across fields. Roofs dripped. Frozen roads softened into mud. One evening Caleb stood beside Elias outside the caboose while sunset burned gold across the retreating snow. You ever miss living in a real house? Caleb asked. Elias looked back toward the little iron car resting solidly on its timber blocks. Warm light glowed through the windows. Smoke drifted gently upward from the chimney. No, he said. Why not? Elias smiled faintly. Because this one understands winter. The next season, travelers passing through the valley often stopped to stare at the caboose standing alone in the field. Most expected it to look foolish. Instead, they saw something else entirely. A home that had survived the hardest winter in years while larger houses struggled around it. And locals no longer laughed when they pointed toward the old railroad car. Usually they just said, "That little thing stayed warmer than all of us."